Hi. So I said that I would talk about astrology and channeling and stuff like that, and think about how science regards these things. Does science deny that there is anything to astrology and channeling? Well, there's several things we have to think about. First of all, in the past, then basically indigenous peoples basically assumed that the universe they lived in was alive. There was a spirit in the trees, there was a spirit in the rocks and the rivers and so on, and that everything had meaning, everything expressed some sort of meaning. And I think um, most of us know that science, as it started off with Newtonian science, which is basically the laws of motion and gravity, um, really denied that, right? Newtonian science gave us the idea that the universe is a machine. So it seems like we have two very different pictures going on here. Um, Basically, the thing is, though, that science itself has changed radically since the time of Newton. We no longer think of the universe or think of particles and the way that things interact with each other as a machine. We don't even think of particles, to be honest, uh, not in the sense that most of us would still think that we think, so to speak. Um, so Newton's idea was that every object is separate, and every object is like a little piece of something that has mass, sometimes a big piece of something that has mass, and that these objects had no intrinsic purpose, no intrinsic nature of their own. They were simply moved around by random mechanical forces. So there was no purpose within that world of science, or let's say the world of that science. Um, and actually, most of us think that way still. But if you've been keeping up with science, you probably have noticed some very radical changes. So, for instance, probably the biggest one was quantum mechanics, which started early 1900s and um, gave us a very different picture of matter in its smallest state, right? So we began to understand that matter is made of atoms, and but then we began to understand that atoms are made of much smaller particles, like the protons in the nucleus, and then the electrons in sort of like an orbit around the nucleus. Um, but then we began to understand that if you look at a proton, it's actually made of three even smaller particles, which we call quarks. And the quarks are essentially, um, they have some mass and they have charge, actually fractional charges, but we couldn't think of them as sort of really extended particles. So when you start looking into the atom, which is the foundation of all matter, uh, it's mainly empty space, 99.999% empty space. So you could almost say there's nothing there. And so we've also come to understand that a particle is actually a, both a particle and a wave. Okay, so I need to talk more about waves, but right now let's just accept that waves don't really have a location. So if a particle is both a particle and a wave, it both has a location and it doesn't have a location. Okay, so it's already getting pretty complex. And then the other thing we came to understand is through quantum physics is that the human mind or consciousness can actually affect a particle. So let's say you have an atom and you think of it as spinning, right? Um, you can measure which direction its spin is in, where it's rotating around, which axis. But according to quantum physics, when you do that measurement, you are projecting it into that spin. You're projecting the particle into a particular spin. So let's say it could be spinning this way, or it could be spinning that way, right? So until you are actually measuring it, it is spinning in both directions at the same time. What does that mean? Nobody knows. Okay. But in order to understand something about astrology or channeling, in order to move us in that direction, all we need to know is that somehow the human consciousness is affecting the world on the tiniest scales, right? So immediately we've changed from Newtonian physics. We have a very different understanding now about the nature of particles because they are not inert, purposeless little pieces of matter. So an inert, purposeless piece of matter could not respond to human consciousness or any consciousness. We don't even necessarily say that it has to be human consciousness, by the way, when we are talking about taking a measurement in physics. Okay, so now we're starting to see there must be some sort of something going on internally in on the part of a particle and an atom. Otherwise, it wouldn't be able to respond to humans. So now when we say, okay, maybe a particle has its own sort of internal directed nature, that seems to mean more than a particle is just purposeless and inert, right? It's different. So from what I've just said, I'm nowhere near justifying um, astrology, um, channeling. I'm nowhere near that yet, but I've made the first step, is what I'm saying. And in fact, if you look at physics today, it's gone a lot further than that. Physics today is very strange. It's sort of stranger than even, what you might expect from the channelers and the astrologers and all the alternative people. So I will explain more because lots and lots of things have happened in the last century in physics. I'm mostly focusing on physics here, but I will address evolution, some changes in biology, and maybe eventually we can get to the point where it makes sense to us that each of the planets has its own particular nature and that there's something internal being expressed, some meaning being expressed, even in the geometrical configuration of the planets and the just simple material bodies. Okay? So more next time. Thank you.